Everyone, welcome to Onshape Live. We're really excited to be here with you today. My name is Cody Armstrong. I'm the Director of Technical Services here at Onshape, and I'm really excited to be giving you our my first Onshape Live presentation. For my presentation, I wanted to answer a question that we get asked quite often. It's a very difficult question to answer, and that is, how do I run a project in Onshape? And so the goal with this presentation is to give you an idea how other engineers, other organizations use Onshape to manage their projects. So we're going to go over from a small engineer, single engineer, to a small to medium-sized business, to a large organization. What Onshape features are they using to run their projects? How and when are they using them? Now, we're also very fortunate in this presentation to be joined by Ryley Karl. Ryley is the president and co-founder of Dark Arrow. Dark Arrow is a very neat company building the product Dark Arrow 1, the fastest, longest range kit aircraft that you can build in your garage. So really neat company, really neat product, and we're very fortunate to be joined by the president, who's going to go through some of the processes that Dark Arrow uses in terms of using Onshape to build, some of the projects around the Dark Arrow 1. So really exciting customer presenter who's going to be joining me in the second half of this presentation. So as I mentioned before, the goal today is really to discuss the critical Onshape tools for managing projects. And the reason I bring this up is, again, the most common question that we get is, I would like to see how other engineers or other companies use this tool or that tool, or how they handle this process. And so the idea today is to give you all the tools that are most common in managing projects in Onshape. And we're going to do this through three examples: a single engineer using a single project as an example, kind of the most basic example. And then we're going to get into a small to medium-sized organization, maybe 2 to 20-ish engineers. And then we're going to go over an example of a large organization where you have lots of external stakeholders and a bit more complexity in the project management aspect. So I'm going to give you three kind of classic examples of things we see quite often, and go through the features that they use, how and when they use them. But then we're going to hear directly from Ryley Karl. Ryley Karl's, again, the president co-founder from Dark Arrow, and there's nothing better than hearing directly from one of our customers about how they use Onshape to create, their projects. Now, with these presentations, we really do encourage you to ask any questions you'd like. There's a chat or a question function, Q&A. And we will be ending things here with an open Q&A session. So Malika will be joining us. She's our moderator for today's session, and she'll be asking relaying any of the questions that you have for either Ryley or myself. So that's a short look at the agenda. Let's dive right into it. Now, as I mentioned, Onshape has a lot of tools that were useful and are very useful in the managing projects realm. And none of these are what a lot of people think of when they think of Onshape. A lot of people think of traditional CAD functions, the extrudes, revolves, sweeps, lofts, and so on. But Onshape has a lot of tools for managing your projects, not necessarily the geometry creation or assembly process or drawings, but actually how do you manage the project itself. There are a number of features here. I'm going to do my best to go through as many of them as possible, but I won't have an opportunity to get through them all. The goal in today's presentation is to get you aware of the various features that Onshape has, and if you're not using some of these features, hopefully give you some incentive to try them out in your next project. So, as I mentioned before, I'd like to start by diving in at the single engineer level. And the reason I mention this is one of the more common questions. I'm a single engineer, product designer, building a product. What would you recommend I use to manage my projects in Onshape? And this is the easiest application because there's no formal approval traditionally and no revision controls needed. So this is one of the simplest applications of project management because a lot of the management of the project is all done by the same person. So there are a few tools that I really recommend here, but let's take a look at the design process. The design process itself is all self-contained. It's a single engineer doing all steps of the process, from ideation to creation and finally publishing of the design. So the process is very simple, and the tools are very very much a part of Onshape core, right? So you have the document, you have real-time collaboration, history, versions, compare, restore, branching, merging. These are tools that everyone has access to. And so these can be tremendously useful from a project management perspective to effectively manage your projects as a single engineer. So let's dive into a quick example of this and show you just a handful of these features and how they can be used. So the first that I'd like to point out, in this example, I'm a single engineer designing a wheel. The first that I'd like to point out is history and versions. If I expand out the history and versions, history is essentially an audit trail of every interaction that's happened with that document. So that gives you every single interaction, every feature creation, everything that's happened in that document as a list. Tremendously useful from a project management perspective because you can see all the various iterations, every interaction with the design. Not only is this useful for having that quote unquote audit trail ability, the ability to go back and look at what you've done in the past, but you can also capture versions to capture those milestones, those moments in time. And so it's a very effective way to capture maybe an initial prototype of your product. Maybe it's that first, iteration that was shipped out to be manufactured, right? So all of those can be easily captured with just simple versions. Versions are like snapshots within the document. They take a look at that moment in time, but you can't edit them. And so I can always go back. In this case, we're going back to about a month ago in February, where the initial prototype of this wheel was released. And so in that case, I'm using just a simple version to manage my projects, and I can control that iteration over time with those versions. Now, not only do you have history, you have versions, you also have branching and merging. These are two very important features for managing your projects because quite often you may have several iterations of design that you need to interact with. And so, for example, let's say that I'm experimenting with different designs. This is my first iteration, and I'm not sure of what design we're going to go with. So I experiment with all of these different iterations, 5-spoke design and 10-spoke design. I have a separate sandbox to use to control those different iterations. And the reason I mention this in the project management context is it's very easy to create lots of duplicates of data when it's really not necessary. Using branching and merging, very unique Onshape features, you can create multiple experiments that run simultaneously. And you can even take these experiments and merge them into one very unique Onshape tool. One last thing I want to point out from a single engineer perspective, one of the most common questions you get when you consider the project over a life of that project is, how do I see what's changed over time? And so one of the biggest tips, forgive me, that I have for this is using compare. You can right click anywhere, any moment in history, any branch, any version, and say compare, and it will compare whatever you have highlighted to the thing you're right clicking. In this case, I'm comparing my branch, which is the 5-spoke wheel design, to my initial prototype created a month ago, right? And so those two are of course very different, but I want to know, how are they different? And so Onshape will tell me, okay, here's the nice graphic preview of the differences, but will also tell me here's the exact features that are different. And so if I want to know, my project has evolved over the last 6 months, I want to see how. I can go back and compare and look at all the features that are different. I can even see individually within the feature, what is it about this thing that is different? So branching, merging, history versions, the ability to use compare tools, those are kind of the key features that I'd recommend, key tips that I'd recommend you really invest in if you're a single engineer looking to better manage your projects in Onshape. So let's dive into my next example, and that is just a slightly larger team, of course. And this is small to mid-size, right? So we're beyond just the single engineer. Now we have a collaborative effort, amongst a group. And that group could be two to as many as 20 we're using in this example. And so in this example, the requirements grow because of the complexity involved with collaboration. So you may have possible consultants. You may have a formal approval process that has to take place where, another person has to approve your design. It gets revision stamped, right? And there are shareable things that you want to share with the customers. So they could be assets for marketing or sales. There's lots of downstream implications of where the CAD data may be needed. And so in these scenarios, collaboration becomes much more important, formal approvals become much more important, revision controls, metadata, these are all critical functions when you start getting into these small to medium size extended team. And so the process is just a bit more involved. And I bring this up to only to show that there are more people involved in it. You have a research and analysis phase, an idea generation, design execution, now a design approval phase. In addition, you have a product launch phase that may include sales, may include marketing, may include a number of teams internally that may benefit from access to that CAD data. So small to medium sized teams, the tool set is very similar to what I showed you just a moment ago. So they're using, the same history, versions, compare, branching and merging features that I showed you a moment ago, but there's an additional layer. Things like folders become especially important. When you're working with multiple people, multiple documents, linked documents, storing all of those things, folders becomes especially important. There's also a series of tools that apply in the Onshape Pro and Enterprise realm that help you to manage and organize that approval process, those revision controls. So formal release management, revision controls, having metadata, right? The approved fields and the revision fields and all of those things established, and the appropriate categories to categorize that metadata. Also very important at this stage is comments, tasks, and markups. One of the biggest tips that I have for managing your projects in Onshape is using the ability to assign tasks. The assigning of tasks and the action items functionality really makes it very easy from a team perspective to communicate what the necessary tasks are that need to be done. So I'm going to go over an example of some of these. Let's dive into it. And in this example, I'm going to go over the quintessential 2 to 20 engineer team. And that team could include, engineers from one company and consultants from another, but it's a larger group that's working on the design. And so one of the first things that you'll notice is different is they're not sharing one by one. When you start into getting into larger groups, you need to be able to share very efficiently, very effectively. And sharing one by one when you have 20 engineers is not a practical solution. And so creating teams is a very nice detail that makes sharing very easy, because I can easily create a team of a handful within the group, share with that team, and avoid having to share one at a time. So one of the first tips that I have for managing your projects at this level is use teams. Teams can be tremendously useful. They eliminate a lot of the potential for error. They greatly simplify the sharing process, and it just makes sense from a management perspective when we're talking about managing our projects. So first tip, use teams. You can see I have the industrial team shared into this project. I have the mechanical team shared into this project. If you want to share with a team, create a team, search it here, and share with them. It's very much like sharing with a user, but you're sharing with a larger group. So that's tip number one, use teams effectively. Now, the second tip that I have is metadata. This is the most common thing that comes up when we talk about management of projects is, well, how do I manage what the part numbers are, or what the descriptions are, or what the revision is, or maybe we have some properties that are particular to our company. And so in Onshape, we have in the bill of materials, I should point out, I'm going to fly out the bill of materials here. We have the ability to define all the part numbers, the names, all of those things, even the revision automatically in the bill of materials, right? You can even do this as part of the release process. And that's really the big tip that I'd recommend for you. If you're going to have an approval process where a revision is created and people have to oversee that, I'd recommend doing that as released objects in Onshape using release management. And the reason I mentioned that is there's a lot of automation, especially around properties and metadata. A good example of this is you'll see in this bill of materials, I have part number and I have name, two very common properties that any company may want to track. And you see I have a few blank part numbers here that I need to create, right? I need to assign. Now, in many organizations, the part numbering scheme isn't just a random string. something that automatically generates based on a scheme, right? It's something that's defined and used throughout a company. And so in Onshape, you can actually do that right inside of release management. So one big tip that I have for you is using the automatically generated part number schemes. You see, I just click the button at the top here. It automatically grabs the next part number so that I'm not manually typing in part numbers for, my various parts and assemblies. So that's one of the first tips that I have is using Onshape's release management enables things like the auto-generating part numbers. It also enables the ability for data to pass through a formal approval process. And the reason this is so important is we're often asked the question, I'm working with a team of engineers. I need to make sure, either a single engineer or a group of engineers approves the design before it's actually released and before, manufacturing prints are made or whatever the scenario may be. And Onshape has release management tools that allow you to do this. So here I'm showing you our default workflow, very simple workflow where the design goes into a pending state where a single person or a team of people can either release or reject the design. If they release the design, other automation comes with it. For instance, the revision is bumped right to the next in the list. You can also set up notifications that go in with this process as well. So a lot of the companies that are working with, the dozens of engineers are really using release management as their mechanism to control when a design is quote unquote released and ready for the real world. So that's my next tip that I have for you. Now, what I'd like to do, I've mentioned properties briefly, and I stress that a lot of the properties that many people care about, the approved by and the part numbers and things like that, are often generated automatically as part of the release process. So if you're using the release management with workflows and auto-generating those part numbers, a lot of the metadata that you may use is automatically there for you. However, there will be situations where you want to create your own. And so I'm going to go into, just for the sake of showing, the properties for this fishing reel. And you can see I have properties, like project, product line, and so on. Finish, project number, and those approved by fields that I was mentioning a moment ago. So I have a lot of properties that my company cares about. Could be project number, finish, whatever it may be. And so one tip that I have for you, especially if you're getting into, these larger organizations where you have a lot of metadata and a lot of different fields that need to be filled out, is to use categories. Categories are a really useful tool for categorizing your properties. And so a good example of this is here I've created a COTS parts, commercial off-the-shelf parts category. This category shows me a different set of properties. So I have vendor of classification. So I'm seeing a filtered list of properties that only apply to commercial off-the-shelf parts. And so one very important tip that I have is as you get more and more engineers, the company gets bigger, the more metadata is stored, the ability to categorize and only show you the things that are relevant to what you're working with, categories is the tool that you want to use to do that. Now, as an administrator, I would recommend going into your company settings and you will find both properties and the ability to create custom properties and categories and the ability to create those categories. All right, so moving on, what I'd like to get into next, just briefly here, is comments, tasks, and markup. This is the next big tip that I have for project management is how do I communicate what tasks I want to assign to a person in an Onshape document? And we still run into a lot of users who will use markup and then a screenshot and send an email. Now, realizing you could do all of that inside of Onshape. So very important tip when you're collaborating with others, use the comments in Onshape. Not only do we have the ability to assign tasks, so here I'm assigning a task to Neil, but we have the ability to create a markup. So I can say, hey, is this the right handle, right? And I could create a markup. It's going to grab the screen for me, and I'm going to just mark up, hey, is that the right handle, right? I hit the green check. It attaches that markup to the comment and assigns this as a task to Neil. This is probably one of the biggest project management tasks tips that I have for you. The moment this is assigned, Neil gets a flyout inside of Onshape. He gets an email notifying him. He sees that screenshot that I've marked up. And most importantly, bear with me for a moment here, Neil has what we call action items. And the reason I stress action items is think of this as like your task management tool inside of Onshape. This is one of the more underused features, in my opinion, when it comes to project management. This is all my assigned tasks or releases, anything that's essentially assigned and waiting for me to complete. And so if I'm Neil or anyone else in my organization, this is where I start my day. And this is my punch list, so to speak, to go through and break down all the various things I need to do and get done. So again, big emphasis here on comments, tasks, and markup, and using those action items effectively as a punch list, a priority list of how to go about your day. So that's comments, tasks, markup. Last comment that I have for you in this scale of organization is use link sharing to your advantage. Oftentimes we have to share with people who are outside of our organization, sales, marketing, other teams. If you go into your share under link sharing, the share dialog, copy it to clipboard, anyone can open that link. So here I am in incognito, and I'm now looking at a 3D CAD model, right? And I don't have to understand CAD. I don't have to sign up for anything. I don't have to download any viewers. So tremendously useful as the downstream tool. We talked about product launch a moment ago. Well, maybe you're sharing a product with the customer, right? Maybe you're creating drawings for a manual. All of those things are really valid applications for sharing in real time. In fact, we even have a view-only toolbar meant to help users who aren't familiar with CAD. So there's a pan button that makes panning really easy. It's really built for those that are not day-to-day CAD users. You can even go in and activate explode views all inside of your browser, link view sharing. Really cool stuff. And one of the most important project management tools is how do I share those CAD assets with everyone else that needs them after the design is done. All right, so we have just a few minutes left before I want to turn things over to Ryley, and I want to jump into the last example that I have for you, and that is the large extended team. Now, I'm classifying this as anything over 30 engineers, but it can vary, and it's just meant to mean more complicated, more complex structure involved with the approval process, for example. Maybe more formal approval process involves several steps. It also likely involves consultants, external people working on the design. And then also it shares a lot, sharing with vendors and customers, sharing with sales and marketing. So those are really critical functions. But at this stage, when you start to get into dozens of engineers, hundreds of engineers, things like role-based access are a huge important factor to consider. The creation of teams works well in the small groups, but if you have dozens or hundreds of engineers, role-based access is a far greater tool. Also available at this level is real-time analytics, the ability to see in real time your project, and also other API integration tools. That's very common with a large extended team. So I want to dive into a few of these, but the first thing I want to start with is creating a project. So under create, you'll see project. And the reason I bring this up is only to show that at the enterprise level, we define a permission scheme that's based on roles, right? And those roles have various permissions based on the scheme. And so I can define, for instance, a restricted access scheme, and that restricts the access to maybe a handful of groups, right? And that's a scheme that's predefined that loads all the necessary roles and defines the permissions accordingly, right? And so that's a permission scheme. And when you're trying to create a project and invite 100 engineers, defining permission schemes, and then defining the roles. Here I'm adding some roles. We'll add a few teams and define their roles. And so now I can go in and define, here's my scheme, here are my roles, click OK, and that project is instantly available to a massive audience, potentially. And that's all up to you, whether your permission scheme allows for it or you want it restricted, and you can change these. So if you decide, we're going to start a project with a restricted access scheme, and then later on, we're going to switch it up, make it more available to others, right? I mean, I can switch permission schemes on the fly. So that's the first tip that I have, is using permission schemes, role-based access to your advantage. It greatly simplifies the process of creating that project, which is, of course, the very first, building block. Now, the next tip that I have for you is using our release management tools to build in all of those various approvals that you may have. It's very common at this stage to have more than just the basic approval process. You may have several stages in that process. And so in this case, I'm going to show you a 3-tier example. This is a 3-stage custom workflow where there are 3 tiers of approval: engineers, QA, and a release manager. And so you have all these various stages, and it goes through, your design goes through those various stages before it's actually released. So using a custom workflow allows you to build all of those approval processes into a unified place inside of Onshape. And it means the entire project management from creation to approval by all teams is managed within this single environment. So that's custom workflows, one very important tip that I have for you. My final tip, and we're going to turn things over to Ryley, is using analytics. Analytics give you real-time insight into the project. So I can go into, for instance, the activity overview. This is one of my personal favorite reports in analytics. And this is essentially the view of my entire company, my entire organization. How many active users do I have? How many exports have taken place in the last 15 days? What projects are taking the most time? You can see I have 917 hours, 13 minutes, and 26 seconds on the engines project. So it's very specific, gives me exactly the information that I need. And most importantly, it's real time. So I'm not waiting for check-in or check-out. I can check this information. I can look to see the status of the project at any moment and know that it's accurate. So analytics, a very important tip for those large organizations. Use the analytics to your advantage, including creating your own. You can add to your own analytics. You can dig into these reports even further with the audit trail. They really do give you a lot of insight into your project. Probably one of the most valuable project management tools, along with action items and tasks that I was showing you a moment ago. All right, so that is what I had planned. What I'd like to do is turn things over to Ryley Karl. So we're going to jump back to the slide deck here. As I mentioned earlier, Ryley Karl is the president and co-founder of Dark Arrow. Dark Arrow is creating the Dark Arrow 1, which is the fastest, longest range kit aircraft that you can build in your garage. Really cool product, really exciting company, and we're really fortunate to be joined by Ryley. Ryley, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you, Cody. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you to Onshape for inviting me to speak. We definitely get a lot of value out of Onshape. So it's a fun topic for me to talk about. And I'll tell you more about that. But first, I'll give a little bit more background information on our project so that everyone's on the same page. So we're looking at here on the slide, a rendering of the Dark Arrow 1, the aircraft we're in the process of designing. So as Cody mentioned, it's a kit plane, meaning you can build it in your garage. It has 2 seats and it's designed specifically for speed, range, and efficiency. So doing some nice long cross-country trips. Next slide, Cody. So we designed the entire Dark Arrow 1 in Onshape. And not only did we design the aircraft in Onshape, but we also designed all the tooling in Onshape. So the whole airframe is carbon fiber composite. It's made on a whole bunch of different CNC machine molds. So we designed all those molds in Onshape as well, and then use that CAD data to feed to our CNC machines to cut out the molds. So next slide, Cody. Where we're at in the project is we're in the process of finishing up the prototype. We're targeting completing the prototype this year and getting into flight testing. So you're looking at mid-stage progress on the prototype with a couple of the other team members here. So I'm kind of in the center, and then 2 other team members, my brothers Keegan and River. We're assembling the wing to the fuselage here. So there's definitely a real physical aircraft to correspond with the CAD model that you see. Next slide. So rather than looking at the entire aircraft, we'll dive down into a little bit smaller subassembly in the aircraft, which is the battery cooling box. So this is a little bit time relevant. We were just building this component earlier last month. So the battery sits on the hot side of the firewall or in the engine compartment, and it has a little bit sensitive operating temperature window. So we actively cool it, and we built this sheet metal box for it to keep it actively cooled. So we're looking at the same thing here in these two different CAD models. It's just on the right, we have the walls of the cooling box shown kind of transparent so you can see what's going on inside. And so that purple component is the battery that the aircraft would use to start the engine. And it's a nice little structure to mount other electrical system components to. So you see a bunch of other things on the outside of the battery box, like fuses and relays and things like that. Next slide, Cody. So there's a couple different versions of this battery box depending on the mission requirements of our customers. They might require a little bit more redundancy in their electrical system architecture. So we have two different iterations on this, a single and a dual battery box, single one on the left and then the dual battery box on the right. And we use Onshape's branching functionality to take a look at these two different designs when we were looking at how we would lay these out in the engine compartment. Next slide. Just a quick screen grab here, I guess, of the CAD environment showing some more of that, what I mentioned with the branching functionality. So you can see there on the left, starting with a dual battery box, we split it off into a single battery box and then also continued to further iterate on that dual battery box design. And this is a prototype, so it's very likely that we're going to iterate on this further. So we'll probably have a couple more versions show up on those different branches there. And on the right, using the compare functionality is kind of nice because our engine compartment is pretty tight for space claim, and we're trying to fit everything in there and not have any interference in the engine compartment with all the different engine accessories and components. So that compare feature is pretty nice when we're comparing the geometry of these different engine accessories. Next slide. So this is just showing some of the physical components again for this small subassembly of the battery box and all the electrical system components that mount to it. So it's a sheet metal box, and then all the little components mount on the outside of the box. Next slide. So we use a bunch of different tools and functionality in Onshape, but rather than read through this list, I think it'd be more interesting if I hopped into the CAD environment and showed you the actual model. So I'm going to do a little screen share here. So you should be seeing my screen now. Can you see it, Cody?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay. We're looking at the dual battery box design here. So you can see the outside of the box is transparent, and check out what's going on inside. And then branching off, we designed a single battery box as well. We'll take a look at that. As I mentioned earlier, this is going to be a kit aircraft, so our customers are going to have to assemble this whole aircraft as well as installing all the systems in their garage and do all that work themselves. So a big part of our project is creating build instructions for our customers. So doing things like having exploded views to share in the build instructions is useful for us. So this is a really nice little piece of functionality that we like. And then again, we can share all this with our customers before they even purchase their kit, so they can start to understand the build experience a little bit better and understand what they're getting themselves into with this type of project. So sharing it is another really key piece of functionality that we like, since not every one of our customers is a CAD user, but they can still interact with those CAD models. So that's really nice. So if anyone wants to learn more about what we've got going on, you can check out our website, darkarrow.com. We've got links to all sorts of other interesting aspects of our project, so check that out. And with that, I think I'll hand it back over to Cody to close out the session.
All right. Thank you, Ryley. That is awesome. Let me bring up my slides and share one more time. And so what we'd like to do, bear with me for a moment here. There we go. Should be sharing again. So what we'd like to do is wrap things up with a question and answer session. So we have a few minutes left, and you have both Ryley and myself on with you. And I'd like to bring in Malika, if you can. Malika, join us and relay any questions from the audience.
All right. So we've got a couple questions here, a few around action items. So wanting to know, are the action items only for enterprise customers? And also, if not, can you share them with non-CAD users as well? Can you assign them to non-CAD users?
They're definitely an enterprise. I believe they're also in professional. I'd have to double check that, so forgive me. I believe they're also in professional. I don't believe they're available to everyone, so I'd have to clarify that. So professional and enterprise, definitely. And the other thing I would say is assigning of tasks is one thing. Also, something to consider is you can tag anyone with comments. So the task management aspect of it, everyone using Onshape can tag someone with a comment, and they give a lot of the same notifications and things like that. So even if you aren't using one of the versions that support action items, you can certainly use comments.
Okay, next we have, can we archive certain branches? They have an issue where they have several branches that are no longer in use and they weren't merged in. So it's become very cluttered.
So it's feedback actually we've heard before. And what I will say to that is, if you haven't already, please submit feedback through Onshape itself. We take feedback like that very seriously, and other people have said that. What you'll see us do in the future is hopefully make that a little bit cleaner and easier to hide, not just branches but also versions and things like that as well. Collapse and expand type functionality, but we'd love your feedback. So if you haven't already, short answer today though is there's no way to kind of collapse that and to make it simpler.
All right, next question. For a small company level, can you manage how all documents are shared in a centralized way? Or do you have to go to each document to manage sharing of that specific document?
No, what I recommend using for the small company is folders. Folders greatly simplify the sharing process, especially if you have multiple documents. So what I'd recommend is create a folder, define the permissions on the folder, and then add documents to the folder as you see fit. And then, assuming they all have the same permissions, the same share permissions, you don't have to share them one at a time. You just add them to the folder and it inherits the permissions of the folder. Good question.
Related to the folders, I've run into issues with not being able to add as many subfolders as I need. Will this be rectified?
To be honest, I'm not certain. I'm not aware of a limitation to the number of subfolders. So forgive me, I haven't. I'm not personally aware of that. If you haven't already submitted it to our support team, please do. But I was not aware of a limit to the number of subfolders.
All right. Next is using standardized part studios a good idea for use in projects? What's the best way to create a part studio template?
I do think it's good to use templates for all the things that are shared, and even in configurable scenarios, things that are shared. I would say my biggest tip for having shared documents across multiple projects is using separate folders and separate linked documents. One of the worst practices that I've seen is having copies of common data sets in every document. That's not a practice that I'd recommend. What I'd recommend is create a folder, create a document, put your shared part studio in that document, and then use that as the mechanism to insert into other places using linked documents, just to stress. You really don't want duplicates of data sets floating around in different documents.
Okay, I'm looking for advice on just sharing drawings using links, not the whole document. Is duplicate sheet the best way to go?
Yeah, there's a few things here. The first thing I would say is this is a big priority for us. I can't speak to timelines or anything like that, but I will say the ability to share a tab within a document, for example, is a big priority. That being said, today, I think the best techniques that I've seen for sharing a single drawing within a larger project involve a new document and inserting something as linked. That's the workflow that I've seen most common, because it allows you to define a very granular level. Like, I want to share just this one tab with this person or people. So that's generally the tip that I'd recommend today if you want to share a specific drawing within a project, but not the whole project.
Okay, question for Ryley. Basically, what would be the best way for people to get in contact with you? There are several people looking for you to be a potential guest speaker, or how would they get in touch with you for that?
You can send an email to info@darkarrow.com. That's probably the best way to reach me, and be happy to hear from you.
Ryley's awesome. So I'm going to wrap things up. We are just a few minutes over. So I'm sorry, everyone, if we didn't get to your questions. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to answer them separately. But I want to say thank you, everyone, for joining. Big thank you to Ryley Karl, for presenting here today. Thank you to Malika for moderating. And thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoy the rest of the show.